Patrick, if you are ready, I will go ahead and introduce your presentation. And I believe, let me just check if, okay, great. So everybody, it is my pleasure to introduce my colleague from PK Fokum Institute of Excellence here in Yaoundé, Cameroon. Patrick Belibi has taught English for 11 years and has worked as a teacher trainer for 6 years. An alumnus of the Fulbright Scholarship, he is currently doing a PhD in English Applied Linguistics at University of Yaoundé 1 here in Cameroon. So I'm very happy to give the floor to Patrick to begin sharing his presentation. And if anyone has questions throughout, please feel free to type them into the chat, and please do keep your microphones muted so that we do not have a lot of background noise. So I will turn it over to Patrick. And I hope, Patrick, just let me know if there's any problems sharing, but I believe you should be able to share screen, and then you can unmute your microphone. And that looks great. We can see your presentation very well.
So hello, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes, please,
Yes.
We can hear you. Further along.
Okay, thank you very much. And welcome to this next session on the West Africa TESOL conference. So my presentation is entitled Investigating High School Science and Art Students' Performance in English. I know from the first reading, it doesn't sound that very great, but it is just something that I wanted to share with you from my experience teaching English language to science and art students for quite some time. So Virginia has already introduced me, so there's nothing more to say. You all know me. My name is Patrick Belibi, and I've been working in Cameroon as an English language teacher for 11 years and also teaching English language courses at the École Normale Supérieure Yaoundé and at the PK Fokum Institute of Excellence. So I'm just going to go straight into this session because we are going to talk about differentiating instruction between arts and science students. So I just want to start with this quote from Gardner and Boerman-Siller. Different disciplines call on different analytic styles, approaches to problem solving and findings, temperaments and intelligences. This is just to already bring up the idea that disciplinary differences in the arts or sciences can definitely have an impact on how students learn and even on their motivation to learn subjects like English. So this is the outline of my session. First, this session reports on a comparative study of the performance in English grammar and reading comprehension of arts and science students enrolled in an English medium school. Second, we are going to give some tips on differentiating grammar and reading instruction in order to satisfy the needs of arts and science students. And third, we are going to do some discussion eventually, and you'll be free to ask questions. So first, who are better in English grammar reading comprehension, in your opinion? Is it the art students or the science students? What I mean by art students is simply students who have an arts background, and science students are those who do STEM fields, for example, science, technology, engineering, and maths. But remember, we are still dealing here with high school students, not university students. Okay, so this is the problem that I found. Many English language teachers generally feel less motivated whenever they are announced that they are going to teach a science class or that they are going to teach English in a science class. Basically, most of us prefer when we are sent to teach an arts class, because we believe that those students kind of are more motivated to study English. So there are two reasons for this. As I said, there's this widespread belief that students in the STEM fields generally do not have high motivation or intrinsic motivation to study language, for example, English language, whereas those in the arts fields may have a higher intrinsic motivation. And also there's this second belief that generally students who are oriented in the STEM fields are poor in English. So we just believe that all they like is their maths, chemistry, physics, and so on, and they are not so much interested in English. Definitely, it is obvious that when students leave middle school, or what we call the lower cycle of a secondary education, that it is obvious definitely that they develop different motivations and learning styles, and this definitely affects the way they would learn and perform in English. But going with the belief that STEM students or science students in general are poor in English, it is just, in my opinion, prejudice against STEM students, because this has not been confirmed by any research findings. So that's why I got into this topic, to try to really do something, investigate and find out whether this is true or not. So what I refer to art students are those who major in literature, French, English, economics, history, geography, religious studies, philosophy, and so on. Whereas the science students, these are basically STEM fields: maths, chemistry, physics, computer science, biology, geology, and so on. There's this other quote by North, who says that there are indeed differences between arts and science students, because specialization in the science students or humanities makes students differ in how they study, how they prefer to be taught, what motivates them within their preferred fields, and what skills are required of them. And then I continue with this differentiation between arts and science students. The arts field generally involve a certain degree of discord that encourage critical thinking, divergent thinking, whereas in the science field, knowledge is just based on facts obtained through the unity of a rigorous process comprising clear research goals, methods, evaluation, and so on. And as I just mentioned, critical thinking is more required in the arts fields, whereas in the science fields, students are actually allowed to reproduce facts, which you will not necessarily see in a literature or any other language classroom. Another difference is that teachers in the arts field tend to use a student-centered approach, which involves a lot of discussion, and students are sharing their opinions and so on and so forth. But in the science class, that is generally not the case, because teachers tend to center everything around them, and the students just have to maybe apply the rules in order to solve the problems that are generally in front of them. There's also critical thinking involved, that's true, but the fact that it is more like a teacher-centered approach that is used makes it quite different from whatever is happening in the arts class. Also, art students are likely to perform better in tests that require more writing, interpretation, and divergent thinking, whereas science students, they are more into analytical, would do pretty much better in analytical tests. So why am I interested in grammar and reading comprehension? It is simply because these two are central to our language proficiency in general. Knowledge of grammar is definitely central to the understanding of text, and success in reading comprehension definitely depends on grammar to a certain extent. And also grammar is more contributive to the understanding of a text than even vocabulary knowledge itself. And now why reading comprehension here? Because reading is definitely a skill, a demanding skill that has a significant impact on students' academic performance, because it is believed that students who are better at reading also do well in school. So there's a strong correlation between reading comprehension skills and performance, even in science tasks. So students who are not good readers, who are very passive readers and have always, have not liked reading at all throughout their academic studies, or throughout their studies, tend to have difficulty even in science subjects. So these were my two research questions. Is there any significant difference in the performance in English grammar and reading comprehension of students having backgrounds in arts and those having a background in science who are enrolled in an English medium school. And how do arts and science students perform in the two subsections of grammar? I just use grammar here because the test was not uniform. We had multiple choice questions in part 1, and then error detection and correction in part 2, because they were given a passage with 10 errors and they just had to identify the errors and correct them. So the participants were 38 students, 19 from the arts class and 19 from the science class, and the age range was 16 to 20. In Cameroon, definitely we have French-speaking students who attend English medium instruction, so there were a few French-speaking students. But again, I do not believe that this had a significant effect on the results, because if we had 8 in the science class, there were like 7 in the arts class. So the study design was quantitative. 3 tests administered each at the end of a 6-week period. Each test had a grammar and reading comprehension section, but the grammar section was subdivided into multiple choice and the error detection and correction section. And basically, in the error detection and correction, students definitely had to correct the errors, okay? Now, this is how I analyze data. I just did basic statistical analysis to determine the frequencies and then to compare which group performed better. So these are the results. I'll just leave you this because this is not so interesting, but I'm just going to the interpretation. So in the arts class, 22% of students had a score of 60% and above, because 60% was considered as a passing grade. And the number increased to 33% the second test and 50% in the third test. Meanwhile, the science class, we see that 50% score had a passing grade in the first test. This went up to 66.7% the second test and more than 72% the third test. So you see here that science students tend to outperform art students in grammar. We see the same analysis in the reading comprehension, where in the arts class, only 11% of students scored a passing grade in the first test. It increased to 44% the second test, and it remained at 44%. Whereas in the science class, 36% scored a passing grade in the first test, compared to 52% the second test and 73% the third test. So here again, science students tend to perform better. If we go to the subsections of grammar tests, you will see the same tendency. So in the MCQ, where they just choose the best answer out of 4 possible responses, science students still outperform art students. So I'm just going to leave some of these details. And you go to the second subsection of grammar, which is basically editing. You're given a passage and you have to identify errors and correct them. We see it is almost the same thing. Science students still perform better than art students. So in general, I ask myself, why are science students better, or why were my science students better than the art students? Maybe because of the nature of tests. There was no reading, no writing, little interpretation, little synthesis, and everything kind of suited the learning styles, the preferred learning styles and assessment routines of science classes. And also maybe it was all related to the placement and orientation criteria, because most of the students who go into the science fields tend to be the best of their classes, even in the lower secondary classes. Whereas those who go to the arts classes tend to be those who only perform better in the arts disciplines. Whereas some of the best students in class did very well in both the arts and science disciplines, and they end up going to the science classes. So this is actually something that shows that in the science classes, you might have students who excel in English language. So why were my science students better than the art students? Probably because I try to differentiate instruction to appeal to the different, or to satisfy the learning needs of my science students, even though they were taking a combined English language course with art students. So if you want to differentiate instruction for arts and science students, just remember your multiple intelligence theory. There are 8 and they are listed here. I'm not going to review them all because we already know what they are: verbal, linguistic, visual, spatial, musical, rhythmic, intrapersonal, logical, mathematical, bodily, kinesthetic, and so on. So I'm just going to get into those that are of interest here. So if you want to differentiate grammar pedagogy for art students and science students, sorry, for arts and science students. In the arts class, students are more interested in you giving them explanations, formulating sentences to explain the rules. You provide lists, you use a text to actually show them how these grammatical structures you're teaching are used in a real language. But in the science class, I think logical mathematical intelligence is better because I've realized that my students in the science classes did not like a lot of literature. So maybe if you can use some formula to facilitate their retention or some games, manipulatives, or problem-solving manipulatives, they prefer that. In the arts class, they were not interested in visuals because they thought that they knew most of the things you wanted to teach. But in the science class, when you use graphic organizers to show patterns, story webs or things like that, they were more interested. In the arts class, my students tended to prefer more interpersonal intelligence, like group work, they were not so much fond of it, even though they tried, but they were not so fond of it. But in the science class, collaborative or cooperative learning task is actually, or was what they actually preferred. So if you gave an activity to do all alone, they were not just there. So to put it in practice, if I'm teaching in the arts class, this is the literature that I'll give to my students. For example, the suffix ER should be added to an adjective to form the comparative in English. The comparative is used to compare two persons or things and so on. This is literature. You give this to art students, they're okay. But in my science class, I realized that they were not, since they did not read their English language exercise books at home, because that is what they told me, I just went straight to some kind of formula, visuals or numbers in order to facilitate the retention. So I'll just write there comparative equals adjective plus ER, comparative more plus adjective, and then some mathematical symbols. Instead of saying the comparative is used to compare to two things and so on, I just put comparative is A and B, whereas superlative A, B, C until the end. Same thing with the first conditional. I'll just give them a rule like this and they will find it easier to apply than lots of literature that they will not probably read. I'm just giving this graph. It's not very clear here, but this is how I was teaching them tenses too. I was not giving them literature on how you form tenses and so on. They preferred something straight to the point like this, where you might just draw an axis and represent to them the present perfect, how it is different from the present perfect, progressive, and so on and so forth. So I got this from one of my textbooks. I think it is there referred to in the references. But when it came to reading pedagogy, because that was for grammar, and there were a lot of other things that I did, of course, including using always visual clues and formulae. But when it came to reading comprehension, I realized something, or this is what I was doing. I would do skimming, scanning, and intensive reading activity with science students, because these are reading skills that everybody must have. But in the arts class, I would do that plus extensive reading because I believe that they needed additional reading material. And because they probably like reading a little more than science students, even though it's generally considered that Africans don't read, but in the arts class, they have literary text to read or textbooks to read. So definitely there was not a big problem with them having more material to read. And then since reading involves pre-reading, while reading stages and post-reading stages, at the pre-reading stage with art students, I generally did not go into greater detail in the same way I did with my science students. Because in my pre-reading activities, I would just do some topic discussion, maybe guessing what the passage is going to be about. And even vocabulary development was not that extensive. But in the science classes, I'll be going into more detail. For example, difficult words, I'll ask students to get into the text and find the sentences where those words are used, try to guess their meanings, and use dictionaries to check whether the meanings are correct, and so on and so forth. We were doing a lot of things in order to build context and activate background knowledge. As far as post-reading activities were concerned, the arts class, we were doing more writing stuff like summarizing, rewriting from a particular perspective, or role-playing, acting, writing sequels. But in the science classes, if I tried something like that, they were not just interested. So I just preferred maybe using a story web a kind of a graphic organizer where I ask them to just represent the story, how they understood it. And maybe I'll scramble a few sentences and ask them to put in order, or just engage in some general class discussion instead of maybe a debate, because they were not generally interested in debates. So I'm just going to get into the discussion session proper. This is a text, for example, it's just an example of maybe what I will do with my students, differences between stalactites and stalagmites, okay? It's a very difficult test for anybody, but I just believe that it is not because maybe arts or science students maybe will not be so much interested in language that they cannot understand difficult text. Understanding a text has nothing to do with maybe the difficulty, or has to do with the difficulty of words, but if you pre-teach them, it is easy. They can always ask or answer comprehension questions, sorry. So reading comprehension is not so much about whether they even understood the test, but if you pre-teach vocabulary and you build background knowledge well, they can answer reading comprehension questions and even score well. So if I had to do this with my science students, what would I do even at the pre-reading stage? So definitely you see here that these are very abstract topics. You maybe start with some pictures in order to activate background knowledge. And after the pictures, you may even want to get into something like even a Venn diagram. So if my students just try to skim and scan the test, I might ask them to actually differentiate between the stalactites and stalagmites from what is there, and they will read the text and try to use a Venn diagram to see what is similar or what is different, and they may even use other kinds of diagrams. Okay, this was just a text to show that this, as a difficult text, would require more background knowledge even for the arts and science classes. But the science students, especially those doing geology, might find it easier to go through. But if you're using a general text, maybe on economics or how the cost of living has gone up, you have to pre-teach terms, difficult or keywords, and you will go into maybe what students know about the cost of living and so on and so forth. In the arts class, they'll probably not be so much interested, but in the science class, this will be something good for them to actually build through. So I will just stop it here because I have not checked the time. How much time do I have left, Virginia?
You have a little more than 5 minutes left.
Okay, sorry. So we are going to stop here. If there are any questions, I'm going to answer them before maybe I can conclude.
And yes, I think there's been a few questions in the chat. So I think I've seen some comments on Facebook Live as well of people agreeing about they feel like their art students are a bit weaker. And then a comment here on Zoom from Yannick that it's not true that science students are more intelligent. As you said, they only have different intelligence from art students, and all kinds of intelligence are important in society. And then a question about, let me see here. So when you were talking about the pre and post tests, was there any additional teaching or reinforcement between the tests?
Sorry, can you take over? Because I heard some noise from the background that kind of put me off.
Yes, sorry about that. Let me see if we have, if someone is, could everybody please make sure that you're muted? Thank you. Okay, so when you were discussing the pre and post tests, was there any additional teaching or reinforcement between the tests?
Oh, basically, I would just say, are you asking this question from the background of the study that I conducted?
Yes, I believe, yes. This question was asked when you were sharing about the study, about your research.
Okay. Thank you for that question. Basically, I was just following the official syllabus. okay, because we have a scheme of work and you just have to go through. And I was the one teaching those classes, okay? So the study is actually based on my experience because I taught English language to arts and science students in an upper sixth class, okay? So basically I was just asked to teach them grammar and reading comprehension. So I was just following the normal syllabus, which meant that the first test was supposed to be kind of a bit easier compared to the second, compared to the third, as we were progressing through the academic year. So this is just based on the first three academic sequences. We call them sequences here in Cameroon, periods of 6 weeks. So I am not going to say that there were major reinforcements because I tried to use the same teaching method and the same strategies that I used in the first test, the same were repeated in the second test, maybe with some slight changes where maybe I understood that the students did not understand, but I didn't plan anything different between the first test to the second to the third. Okay,
Thank
and
you,
then,
Patrick.
okay, sorry about this. And then somebody said that science students are not just more intelligent. I did not say they were more intelligent. I just said that maybe they were more motivated. It is all about motivation because if I was just teaching them in the traditional way we teach, I'm not very certain that they would have found any interest doing English language because English for them was not even a compulsory subject, but it was compulsory in the arts class. But both groups had to be in the same class because the school just thought that having around 38 students, they would not allow me to teach just 19 and go and teach 19. They just wanted me to do something to reinforce students' level in English. So I thought I taught all groups in the same way, but I had to put in the background that if I did not do something to appeal to the learning needs of science students, they would just not want to participate because English was not required in their studies. Whereas in the arts class where English was required, students tended to perform less well than their science counterparts.
Thank you. I think that's a helpful clarification. And there's thanks for that in the chat as well. And there had been a few questions about differentiation between art students and science students when you're teaching. I think that
Yes.
you cleared up one of the questions that in your study, you were teaching the same thing and the same
Yes,
way
exactly.
to both. Is that correct? Okay, great. And then I think we have a hand raised. Johnson Abibi, did you have a question?
My question is, did you give them a test to ascertain their abilities as a baseline before you conducted the study? There are schools where they classify, where they pick the best students and put in science class, and then just leave the other ones in arts class. So did you conduct any survey, any test to establish the baseline that they have equal abilities, mental ability, as it were? Thank you.
Okay, thank you for this question. I did not really conduct a baseline for this test, but I had my, how do you call it, my diagnostic evaluation at the start of the class. I didn't think that for this particular study, I would bring up those results that I had and I use as a baseline, okay? I was just thinking that normally since these students were all in the same classes because that was a secondary and high school, they had basically the same teachers in the lower secondary school and they were all taking the same subjects in the same classes. But when they had to move to high school, lower six and upper six, now they were divided into, I mean, some were oriented in the science section and others in the art section. That is only where differentiation came, but they had the same subjects throughout the lower secondary. That's why I just believe that having had the same teachers throughout, it was not probably relevant for me to try to find out whether they had the same abilities because they were supposed to have the same abilities. And contrary to popular belief that art students are actually better than science students, I was shocked with the results that I got throughout the academic year. My science students were just better throughout. And it is probably the same thing that I'm seeing today at the PK Focam Institute of Excellence, where students who are doing the science fields tend to be more active and even score better than those who are in the economics and management class, where they were doing more humanities and language and literature. So basically, it is the same trend that I'm seeing after teaching at the PK Focam Institute for 2 years.
Thank you, Patrick. And
It's okay.
we are actually just about at the end time for the presentation. So we do have a break before the next presentation, but Patrick, did you have any final words? Or there's a lot of interest about your research in the chat. So unfortunately, we don't have time for all of the questions, but any final thoughts?
Okay, my final thoughts are this. Arts, science students are not as dull in the language as we often believe. They probably have different motivations in learning the language, and they may have lower intrinsic motivation just because they believe that because they have been oriented in the science fields already, they do not need lots of English language in order to succeed academically, that they instead have to reinforce their knowledge in their science fields. So I'm just appealing to high school teachers or those like myself who are teaching even college arts and science students to always try to have this in the background of their mind and differentiate instruction as much as possible. Use the strategies, some of the strategies I showed there and others that you know in order to appeal to all of your learners' learning needs and even try to satisfy the way they are assessing their own disciplines. So thank you very much for listening. And I hope that we can continue chatting in one way or the other throughout this conference.
Thank you so much, Patrick. There was definitely a lot of interest and questions, and it seems like people would like to engage more about your research. So I think that would be great if anyone is available to continue discussing and interacting in the chat, or we have the West Africa TESOL Telegram group, and we have the conference WhatsApp group as well. And I'll add those links to the chat. But thank you so much, Patrick, for a very interesting presentation that brought up a lot of questions and a lot of thoughts and helps us to look at those differences in the type of motivation between students who are studying different fields and thinking about how to differentiate instruction to meet their needs. So thank you so much. And thank you everyone for attending. We have about 12 minutes, I think, until our next presentation will begin. So at 1:30 GMT time, we will have Robert Kenfack with Evaluating Learners with Google Forms, and that presentation will be right here in the same Zoom meeting. You don't need to leave, you can just stay, and we will begin with that shortly. So thank you again.
Thank you.
Rodrigue, congratulations for the job well done. You've done well.